Welcome to Antares Podcast. Relax and learn.
Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're taking a look at the Superman curse.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, right? We've got these excerpts from a Spanish language article. It really digs deep into a bunch of strange things that have happened around Superman productions over the years.
I mean, it's definitely one of those pop culture legends, right?
Yeah.
That people have been talking about for years. So what are we thinking? Is it like a real curse?
That's what we're going to try to figure out, right?
Right.
Is it a real curse or just, a bunch of really, really bad coincidences?
Yeah, exactly. And it seems like a lot of people feel like this whole curse thing, it starts right at the beginning, right?
Oh, yeah. With Superman's creators?
Yeah, with Siegel and Shuster, who basically got totally ripped off. I mean, they sold the rights to Superman for nothing.
For peanuts.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
And then, struggled financially their whole lives. I mean, that's kind of a rough start to the whole Superman story, isn't it?
Not a great omen.
No, not a great omen. And it kind of feeds into that whole starving artist thing, you know?
Right.
The creators who never really get to enjoy the success of their own work.
It's almost like foreshadowing
for
the rest of Superman history. And then, you have probably the most famous Superman of all, Christopher Reeve.
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, his story is just, it's so sad.
So tragic.
You have this guy who plays the ultimate symbol of strength, right? Invincible. And then he has this horrible accident and becomes paralyzed.
Right.
It's almost like Shakespearean.
Yeah.
It's tragic twist of fate.
Right.
The article even mentions that back when his accident happened, the media was all over this curse angle.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. It was almost as if Reeve's accident was some kind of, I don't know, cosmic punishment.
Oh, wow.
For daring to play this godlike character.
For playing God.
Yeah.
And just to add to the whole tragic element of it, his wife, Dana Reeve.
Oh, right.
She died young, too, from lung cancer, and she was a non-smoker.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I mean, I guess it just so adds to that whole idea of a curse, doesn't it? It does, but I mean, these are awful things that happened, but maybe it's not statistically that strange, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, accidents happen, people get sick.
Right.
It's just that when it's someone famous, it seems like the media just blows the whole thing out of proportion.
I guess our brains are kind of always looking for patterns.
Totally.
Especially when something just seems so out of the ordinary.
Yeah.
We have to, find a reason why.
It's we're trying to make sense of the chaos.
Exactly.
Okay, so speaking of trying to make sense of things, let's talk about Margot Kidder.
Oh, Lois Lane.
Yeah, Lois Lane.
Right.
Who, had a very public struggle with bipolar disorder.
Right.
And there were definitely a few, incidents in her life that kind of fueled this whole curse narrative.
When she disappeared, right?
For a few days. And then there was that car accident, too. But, what's interesting is that the article also mentions that Kidder herself, completely dismissed this idea of a Superman curse.
She did.
Yeah, she basically said she was just lucky to have survived those incidents. No curse involved.
So maybe she was one of the lucky ones who escaped it.
Maybe.
So then you have Marlon Brando.
Jor-El,
Superman's dad. He went through some really heavy stuff too, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, his son being imprisoned and then his daughter's suicide. I mean, that's just devastating. No parent should have to go through that.
It's unimaginable.
Yeah. The article said that after those events, he became pretty reclusive and his health really started to decline. I mean, it's heartbreaking.
It just shows that no matter who you are, life can just throw these awful things at you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's that just terrible story of Lee Quigley, the baby who played Kal-El.
Oh, right.
Dying at just 14 from substance abuse.
Yeah.
It's just awful.
It's really sad. It reminds you of how fragile life is.
Yeah.
And how none of us are immune to tragedy.
Right.
But I guess the question is, are we giving this Superman curse too much power?
Yeah, I mean, are we?
Are we just looking for patterns? Because it's a human thing, right? To want to find meaning in things.
Yeah, I mean, we want explanations.
Exactly, especially when it comes to things that we don't understand.
Even if those explanations aren't, necessarily real.
Right. And, speaking of trying to find meaning in things, Richard Pryor, who played Gus Gorman in Superman the 3, he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis.
Right.
And later on, he died from a heart attack.
Right.
So, another tragedy connected to the Superman franchise.
So are we seeing a pattern here? Or is this just, like you said, just random bad luck?
Well, maybe. Or maybe it's something else. We haven't even touched on the really early Superman actors.
Oh, yeah. Like the very first guys to play Superman.
Exactly.
What happened to them?
Well, Kirk Alyn, the first one, he basically just kind of disappeared.
Oh, wow.
After his Superman days, he had a really hard time finding roles. Just kind of faded from the public eye. And then there's George Reeves, the second Superman.
Uh-huh.
And he died under some pretty mysterious circumstances.
Ooh, like what?
Well, there's always been a lot of debate about whether it was suicide or maybe something more sinister.
That's kind of creepy.
It is, right? But again, it's like, are we just seeing what we want to see?
Right, right.
Because we're already looking for evidence of this curse.
I mean, but it's hard not to connect the dots, right? Especially with all these tragic events.
I know. But, statistically speaking, if we looked at any group of people over a long enough period of time, we'd probably find a similar mix of good and bad things happening.
So you're saying it's all just coincidence?
Not necessarily. But before we jump to conclusions, there's a whole other side to this curse idea that we need to explore.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What else is there?
Well, remember how we talked about Superman's creators and how they were basically exploited?
Oh yeah, that was pretty rough.
Yeah, the article really goes into detail about how badly they were treated. Like, there's this story about how the CEO of DC Comics basically just tossed Shuster, the artist, $100 and told him to go find a new job.
Whoa, that's cold.
Right? And it really highlights that whole power imbalance in creative industries, where artists often don't have a lot of leverage.
It makes you wonder how often that kind of thing happens.
Right. And it gets worse. By the 1970s, Shuster was basically blind and living in poverty. Siegel actually had to launch a whole public campaign just to get DC Comics to acknowledge their contributions and give them a pension.
Wow, that's just awful. It's almost like a different kind of curse, a very real and human one.
Yeah, where the people who create these iconic characters end up being exploited and forgotten, almost like they're cursed by their own success.
It's a really sobering thought.
It is, and it makes you wonder if maybe that's a more realistic interpretation of the Superman curse. Not some supernatural force, but the very human failings of greed and exploitation.
So you're saying the real curse might be the way the industry treats its creators?
It's definitely something to think about. But there are even more layers to this whole curse thing. Another example that really complicates things.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's this other example?
Well, it has to do with the guy who was the voice of Superman in the radio show and the animated cartoons back in the 1940s.
Oh yeah, vaguely remember hearing about that guy. He was like the original voice of Superman, right?
Exactly. His name was Bud Collyer. And for a whole generation of kids, he was Superman. But here's the thing, his life didn't really follow that tragic pattern we've been talking about.
So he didn't have any like major misfortunes or anything?
Not really. In fact, he had a pretty successful career even beyond Superman. He was actually a very popular game show host.
Wait, the voice of Superman was a game show host? That's kind of funny.
I know, right? But it gets even more interesting. Collyer was also a decorated war hero.
Seriously?
Yeah. During World War II, he served in the Merchant Marine and even got a commendation for rescuing fellow sailors during a torpedo attack.
Wow, so not only did he voice the Man of Steel, he was a real-life hero, too.
Exactly. And he lived a long and fulfilling life, passing away at the age of 61 from a circulatory ailment. No tragic accidents, no mysterious deaths, no public scandals.
Okay, so Bud Collyer seems like he's the exception to the rule. Does his story, like, debunk the curse altogether?
Well, it definitely complicates things. If there is a curse, why didn't it affect him? Could it be that the curse is more selective than we think?
Maybe it only applies to the people who actually portray Superman on screen, not just lend their voice.
That's one possibility. Or maybe it has more to do with the individual own, like resilience,
So like some people are just more susceptible to the curse than others.
It's an intriguing idea, isn't it? That maybe some people are just more prone to bad luck or have a harder time coping with adversity.
Or maybe it's about the choices they make.
Right.
And how they deal with fame and fortune.
Exactly.
So I guess the question is, are we any closer to figuring out if this Superman curse is real or not?
I think the evidence is a lot more ambiguous than it might seem at first. We have plenty of tragic stories, but then we have examples like Bud Collyer. They kind of challenge that whole curse narrative.
So it's really up to each person to decide what they believe.
Exactly. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, there's one more example I want to bring up that might really make you think.
Oh, okay, lay it on me.
Well, it involves the creators of those classic Superman cartoons, the Fleischer brothers.
Oh yeah, I think I remember reading about them. Weren't they like animation pioneers?
They were, but things didn't exactly end well for them.
What happened?
Well, they lost control of their studio, faced financial ruin. Max Fleischer actually died in poverty.
Wow, it's almost like the curse followed them even after they stopped working on Superman.
It does kind of seem that way, doesn't it?
And speaking of strange occurrences, wasn't there that whole Superman Returns DVD incident too?
Oh yeah, where a bunch of bizarre accidents happened to the DVD production crew.
Yeah, like what?
People falling downstairs, getting mugged, even falling through a glass window.
Whoa, that's wild.
It is, right?
It's like the curse was just like waiting to strike anyone who got too close to Superman.
Or maybe it's just a case of confirmation bias. We're already so primed to believe in this curse that we interpret any negative event as proof.
Okay, but what about the way Superman's creators were treated? We touched on it earlier, but the article really goes into detail about how badly they were exploited. Like, the CEO of DC Comics apparently tossed Shuster $100 and told him to get a new job.
Yeah, that's a pretty harsh detail. It really speaks to the power dynamics in creative industries.
And it gets worse. The article says Shuster was practically blind and living in poverty by the 1970s. Siegel had to launch a public campaign just to get DC Comics to acknowledge their contributions and give them a pension.
It really raises some serious questions about intellectual property rights and how creators are treated.
Absolutely. It's almost like a different kind of curse, a very real and human one, where the people who create these iconic characters end up being exploited and forgotten.
Perhaps that's a more realistic interpretation of the Superman curse. Not some supernatural force, but the very human failings of greed, exploitation, and putting profit before artistic integrity.
So are we saying the Superman curse is just a combination of bad luck, media hype, and the inherent struggles of being human?
It's definitely more nuanced than just a straightforward curse. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to bring up one more example that might really make you think.
Okay, you got me. What is it? What could make us rethink this whole Superman curse thing?
So it has to do with Bud Collyer.
Bud Collyer, okay.
He was the voice of Superman on the radio show and the animated cartoons from back in the 40s.
Oh, right. Yeah, he was like the original voice of Superman, wasn't he?
Exactly. I mean, for an entire generation, he was Superman. But what's interesting is that Collier's life didn't exactly follow this tragic pattern we've been seeing, you know?
So no, like, major misfortunes?
No, not really. Actually, he had a very successful career even beyond Superman. Like, he was a really popular game show host.
Wait a minute, the voice of Superman was a game show host?
Yeah, I know. It's kind of a funny combination, right?
It is, yeah.
But it gets even more interesting. Collier was also a decorated war hero.
Are you serious?
Yeah. During World War II, he served in the Merchant Marine. He even got a commendation for rescuing some of his fellow sailors during a torpedo attack.
So not only did he voice the Man of Steel, but he was like a legit real-life hero, too?
Exactly. And he lived a long and pretty fulfilling life. He died at the age of 61 from a circulatory ailment.
Okay, so no tragic accidents, no mysterious deaths, no scandals. It really sounds like Bud Collyer was the exception to this whole curse idea.
He really does, doesn't he? But it makes you wonder, you know, if there is this curse, why didn't it get him? Like, was it just more selective than we think?
Maybe it only applies to the people who, you know, actually put on the suit and play Superman on screen, right? Not just his voice.
That's possible. Or maybe, you know, maybe it's more about an individual's resilience. You know, like how they handle the tough things that life throws their way.
So are you saying some people are just more susceptible to this curse than others?
It's a thought, isn't it? Maybe some people are just more prone to bad luck, or they just have a harder time dealing with difficult situations.
Or maybe it's about the choices they make, you know?
Right.
How they handle fame and fortune.
Yeah, exactly.
So after hearing all of this, are we any closer to figuring out if this Superman curse is real or not?
Honestly, I think the evidence is a lot more complicated than it seems at first glance. Like, we have all these tragic stories, but then you have cases like Bud Collier's that just don't fit the pattern.
So I guess in the end, it really comes down to what each person believes.
Pretty much. But before we wrap up this section of our deep dive, I want to bring up one last example that might shift your perspective a little bit.
Ooh, okay, I'm listening. What is it?
Well, have you ever thought about looking at Superman as like a symbol of resilience?
Resilience, okay.
Yeah, like we always talk about how Superman represents hope and strength, right?
Right.
But maybe there's more to it than that. Maybe it's not just about being invincible, but about being able to overcome tough times.
I see what you're saying. So you're saying even with this whole curse thing hanging around, it's more about how Superman always bounces back, right?
Exactly. Like, even when faced with tragedy and misfortune, the Superman story, it keeps going. It never really dies.
So it's a reminder that even when things go wrong, there's always a chance for things to get better. There's always hope.
Exactly. So maybe this whole curse idea, it's not really about bringing Superman down, but about making him even stronger, you know?
Like it tests him, but he always comes out on top. That's a pretty cool way to think about it.
You know what? It kind of reflects what we all go through in life, doesn't it?
Yeah, totally.
We all face challenges, right?
Right.
We all have setbacks. but it's how we deal with them that really matters.
So maybe the real lesson here isn't to be afraid of bad things happening, but to learn how to overcome them.
That's it. And who better to teach us about that than Superman himself?
That's a great point to end on. I think that's something for all of us to remember. So if you're out there and you're, fascinated by this Superman curse, keep digging, keep asking those questions. Just remember to keep an open mind. And even when things are looking bad, there's always, always hope. Thanks for tuning into our deep dive today.
Well, we were talking about the Fleischer brothers
Uh-huh.
and how they kind of had a rough time even after they stopped working on Superman.
Yeah.
It's almost like, did the curse follow them or something?
It makes you wonder, right? Like,
Yeah.
how far does this curse thing reach?
And then, there's that whole thing with the Superman Returns DVD.
Oh, right, where all that crazy stuff happened to the production crew.
Exactly.
People getting hurt, mugged.
Falling through a glass window.
Yeah, it's wild.
It's like every time someone tries to get close to Superman, something bad happens.
Right.
It's spooky.
It is.
But, maybe we're just like seeing what we want to see.
Yeah.
Because we're already looking for evidence of this curse.
I mean, that's confirmation bias, right?
Exactly.
But what about, the way Superman's creators were treated?
Oh, yeah.
The article really gets into how they were taken advantage of.
Yeah, it's pretty awful.
Like that story about how the CEO of DC Comics basically just tossed Shuster $100 and was like, go get a new job.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of how, sometimes artists just don't have much power.
Right.
Especially back then.
And it gets even worse, right? The article says that by the 70s, Shuster was basically blind, living in poverty.
Yeah.
And Siegel actually had to start this whole campaign to get DC Comics to even acknowledge their contributions and give them a pension.
It's a shame, really.
It's like a whole other kind of curse,
Yeah.
like a real human one,
Right.
where people who create these incredible characters end up being forgotten and exploited.
It makes you think.
It does.
Maybe that's the real Superman curse.
Yeah.
Not some supernatural thing, but just, greed and exploitation.
The dark side of the industry.
Exactly.
So is that what we're saying then? The Superman curse is just a mix of bad luck, media hype, and the way, the system kind of chews people up and spits them out.
It's definitely more complicated than just saying it's a curse, right? But before we finish up, I want to leave you with one more thought. What if, instead of looking at all this bad stuff, we try to see Superman as a symbol of resilience?
Resilience.
Yeah. Like, we always talk about how he represents hope and strength. But maybe there's something more to it.
He always gets back up.
Exactly.
Even when things are really rough, he
Right.
never gives up.
So even with all this talk about a curse, maybe the Superman story is really about overcoming those challenges,
Right.
about bouncing back.
Yeah.
And, maybe that's the real message here. Even when things are tough, there's always hope.
That's actually a really nice way to think about it.
It is, right.
So maybe the lesson of the Superman curse isn't about being afraid of what might happen,
Right.
but about learning how to be strong even when things go wrong.
I love that.
So for anyone else out listening, you're into all this Superman curse stuff.
Yeah?
Keep learning about it, keep asking those questions, but remember,
What's that?
there's always hope and there's always a way to find strength even when things are tough.
That's a perfect way to wrap things up.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.